Thì bạn bắt đầu nha.
November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala?
Yes, I arrived in
Yes,
Guatemala.
yes, I arrived in Guatemala. Where did I arrive?
I arrived in Guatemala.
Guatemala, right? I arrived in
Guatemala.
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead,
Yes.
November
First.
1st. Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
I arrived in Guatemala on the
Well,
day
me,
of the
AJ.
dead.
I arrived in Guatemala on the
The
Day
day
of the
of the
Dead,
dead.
November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No, I
No, I didn't arrive in Guatemala
November 3rd.
on November 3rd.
I arrived
in Guatemala on November
1st.
1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
On November 1st.
November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st.
First.
Where did I arrive on November 1st?
In Guatemala.
Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala on November
November
1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Was I angry about this holiday?
No, I wasn't angry.
No, I wasn't angry about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
I wasn't sad.
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday.
Holidays.
Who was curious about this holiday?
Me, I just.
I was, AJ. I was curious about this holiday. What was I curious about? The holiday, right? I was curious about the holiday. Which holiday was I curious about?
The day of the
Which
dead.
holiday
Today
was I curious about?
I was curious about the day,
Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. Was I curious about the Day of the Dead? Or was I curious about Christmas?
I was curious about the
I
day
was
of
curious
the dead.
about
The
the Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. So I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where did I go?
I go to the cemetery.
To the cemetery. I went to
to
the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery or did I go to the airport?
I went to the cemetery.
See, I went to the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
Me, I went to the cemetery.
Me, right, AJ. I went to the cemetery. Where did I go? To the cemetery, right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery?
On November 1st.
November 1st,
I went
the Day of the Dead.
I went to the cemetery on November 1st.
On the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Why did I go to the cemetery?
To see what was happening.
To see what was happening. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
Me, I went to the cemetery
Me,
to
AJ,
see what was
went
happening.
to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where was the cemetery?
In the cemetery.
In Guatemala. The cemetery was in Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead?
It's a holiday. It's
a holiday. The Day of the Dead is a holiday. When is the Day of the Dead?
On November 1st.
November 1st. The Day of the Dead
is on November 1st.
Was and is November 1st. Okay. So I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead to see what was happening. What I found was quite interesting. Was it boring?
No, it
wasn't boring. Was it interesting?
Yes, it was interesting.
Yes, it was interesting. The cemetery was interesting. How did I feel about
interesting.
the cemetery?
I feel interesting. I felt interesting.
I felt it was interesting. Or I thought it was interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting?
It was interesting.
It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting?
The day of the death.
The cemetery. The cemetery was interesting. When was the cemetery interesting?
On November 1st.
It was interesting on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Okay, the atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Was the atmosphere very sad? No, the atmosphere was not sad. The atmosphere was like a party. The atmosphere was very happy. Was the atmosphere sad or happy?
The atmosphere is happy.
The atmosphere was happy. The atmosphere was like a party. What was like a party? The atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Where was the atmosphere like a party?
In the cemetery in Guatemala.
In the cemetery. Right? The cemetery. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. Was the atmosphere like a party at my house?
No, at my house in the cemetery.
No, not at my house. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. The atmosphere was not like a party in my house. So the atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere. Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Where were the families sitting?
The families were sitting around
the graves. Right? They were sitting around the graves. Who was sitting around the graves?
The families was sitting around the graves.
Families, right? The families were sitting around the graves. Were they sitting around the trees?
No, it wasn't sitting around the trees.
They weren't sitting around the trees.
They were sitting around the
graves.
They
were sitting around the graves.
Graves.
So, where were they sitting?
They were sitting around the
graves.
Around the grave.
Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors?
Yes.
Yes. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their friends?
No, they weren't sitting around the grave of their
not really. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Who was sitting around the graves?
The families.
That's right. Families were sitting around the graves. Whose graves were they sitting around?
Their dead
Whose graves were they sitting around?
Their dead ancestors.
Yes, their dead ancestors. Their ancestors. Their ancestors' graves. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors or the graves of their friends?
They were sitting around the graves
of their dead They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers. Who cleaned the graves?
The families cleaned the graves.
The families. What did they add?
They added fresh flowers.
They added fresh flowers. Did they add food?
No, they didn't add food.
No, they didn't add food. Did they add money?
Yeah, no, they didn't
add money. They added fresh flowers.
Flowers.
What did they clean?
They cleaned the grave.
They cleaned the graves. Whose graves did they clean? Their ancestors, right? They cleaned their ancestors' graves. Where did they add flowers? Where?
On the grave.
Oh, they added flowers to the graves.
To the grave.
That's right. They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers. Good. I walked through the cemetery. And admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Where did I walk?
I walked through the cemetery.
Through the cemetery. I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the park?
No, I didn't walk through the park.
No, I didn't walk through the park.
I walked
through the cemetery.
Walked.
Where did I walk?
I walked
through the cemetery.
Through the cemetery.
Who walked through the cemetery?
Me, I walked through the cemetery.
I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the cemetery, or did I walk through the park?
I walked through the cemetery.
I walked through the cemetery. That's right. And I admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Did I admire the beauty of the trees?
No, I didn't admire the beauty of the trees.
I didn't admire the beauty of the trees.
The beauty of
Did I admire the beauty
the colorful flower
of the children?
No, I didn't admire the beauty of children.
I didn't admire the beauty of the children.
Admire.
What did I admire?
I admire the beauty.
Flowers, right? Yeah, I admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Who admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers?
I admired the beauty
right. AJ,
of all the colorful
admired
flowers.
the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Where were the flowers?
In the cemetery.
Yeah. On the graves, right? Or in the cemetery. Right? The flowers were on the graves.
In the cemetery.
In the cemetery. Were the flowers in the park?
No, the flower.
No, they weren't in the park. Were the flowers in my house?
No.
No, they weren't in my house. Where were the flowers?
The flowers were on
the graves
in the cemetery.
In the cemetery. Where did I walk?
I walked through the cemetery.
I walked through the cemetery. When did I walk through the cemetery?
On November 1st, the day of the dead.
November 1st, the day of the dead.
I walked through the
November
cemetery
1st, the day of the dead. I walked through the cemetery.
November 1st.
What was the cemetery like?
Like a party.
Like a party. It was like a party. The cemetery was like a party. Was I curious about this holiday?
Yes, I was curious about this holiday.
Yes, I was curious about this holiday. Which holiday was I curious about?
The Day of the Dead.
The Day of the Dead.
The Day of the Dead.
I was curious about the Day of the Dead.
Curious about the Day of the Dead.
So I walked through the cemetery. There was also color in the sky because many kids were flying kites. Where was the color? In the sky, that's right, in the sky. Why was there color in the sky?
Because many kids
were flying kites. The kites. There was color in the sky because kids were flying kites. Who were flying kites?
Kids was flying kites.
Kids were flying kites. Was the sky colorful, or was the sky gray?
The sky was colorful.
The sky was colorful. What was colorful?
The sky was colorful.
The sky, right. The sky was colorful. Why was the sky colorful?
Because kids were flying kites.
What were the kids flying? Kites. That's right. The kids were flying kites. Where were they flying kites?
in the cemetery.
In the cemetery. The
they
kids were
was
flying kites
in the cemetery.
in the cemetery. Who was flying kites in the cemetery?
Kids were flying
Kids,
kites
right?
in the
Children.
cemetery.
Kids were flying kites in the cemetery. Some families were having a picnic next to the graves. We, in the United States, don't do this. So some families were having a picnic next to the graves.
Yes.
They ate, they drank,
and
they chatted together. Did they eat?
Yes, they ate.
Yes, they ate. Who ate?
Watermelon.
Families, right? Of course, families ate. What did they eat?
They ate Guatemalan food.
Ate Guatemalan food, right? Food from Guatemala. Right? The families ate Guatemalan food. Did they eat American food?
No, they didn't eat.
No, they didn't eat American food. They ate Guatemalan food.